Hello there. Just before we get into today's content, I want to give a quick shout out to a new friend of mine, the Mimic Box. The Mimic Box are a 3D print company that you can find on Etsy. These guys, in fact. And they're really, really cool and they're really, really lovely. They are based in Portugal and they do 3D prints and they ship them out at a very reasonable cost. And if you go to their website right now, go to their website and you order anything, just type in the promo code JJPainting for 10% off. Just to share the love of the hobby. It supports them, it supports me. I'd appreciate if you did it. You support your own hobby, and let's get into it. Hello there, and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this channel? Well, if you're wondering what we do on this channel, it's quite straightforward. We take a topic from the hobby, sometimes it's the lore, the hobby itself, sometimes it's a book review, sometimes it's Battle Company Challenge, sometimes it's something completely unrelated. We take a model that is somewhat related to what we're talking about, and even then, only sometimes, we paint it up, we have a chat, we all have a really good time, and I hope you guys do as well. So, Dark Angels, the Dark Angels chapter. We're finally doing a video about the Dark Angels chapter, and they are, to be completely fair to them right now, a bit of a hot mess. But don't get me wrong, they're not bad. They're just a bit of a mess. And that's fine, you know, a hot mess can be fun sometimes. But it is something that I want to talk about, and I'd like to talk to you guys about it, because I'd like to know your opinions on things. You know, guys, I really appreciate your comments, the long ones especially. They are a really great read over the breakfast table. But obviously we can't talk about the Dark Angels without painting something from the Dark Angels chapter. So today we're painting this. Yes, we are painting a Ravenwing Sergeant, a biker Ravenwing Sergeant, and a firstborn as well, because painting Primaris, I like it, but I want to paint something that's not Primaris. Anyway, so without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, so let's start off with a very quick history and recap, as I always do on my videos. I do feel like I'm turning into a bit of a pseudo-history channel, but, you know, that's just the way I run my channel. And if you don't like it, then smash that no, please don't do that. Anyway, so, with the Dark Angels, the thing to remember about their history has always very much revolved around two very big things. Deathwing and Ravenwing, from a gameplay standpoint. From a lore standpoint, there's always been this air of mystery, the Unforgiven, the Fallen, all those good things, which, to be fair, the Horus Heresy has started to unpack over the years. Now, the idea that they were the only legion who had an internal split. Anyone that's been following the Horus Heresy up to this point will know that the other legions who stayed loyal also had splinter factions and also had groups that went renegade. Obviously, it didn't cost them their home planet and a big chunk of their core warriors, but that's not the topic of this story. So from a lore perspective, they are in many respects still very much in line with a lot of the other loyal legions, but from a gameplay perspective, that's what we're going to be focusing on here today. For a very long time, we're the only Space Marine chapter that could give you an entire army, obviously, of Terminators, a la the Deathwing, and even bikes for a while, a la the Ravenwing. Now, obviously, this was in a time before our current Primaris and vehicle kit cup overflowing, as it does to this day. This was back in a time when there were far fewer kits and far more metal models as well, which is a bit of a different topic, but hey-ho. So, ultimately, what it came down to with the Dark Angels is you did have access to more, but ultimately, you were taking more of the same models. So, Deathwing Terminators, yes, you could take them as troops choices. Ravenwing bikes, yes, you could take them as troops choices as well. But ultimately, in the game-wise, the rules were where it was changed quite differently. Deathwing and Ravenwing were both fearless, didn't run away, for those of you who don't remember that, for a really long time, whereas other bikes and other Terminators weren't. And that was quite an important thing. They were a fearless chapter. Their grim resolve, as is their chapter tactic now, very much as was written into the nature of their army. But the thing to have to remember is this is going right the way back to 4th edition, so this was a really long time ago. And if we then bring this up to modern times, what have they retained from that? Well, they obviously have a chapter tactic now, but a lot of the things that Dark Angels have back then are also characterized by things other chapters simply didn't have, and in many respects no one thought they were going to have. So for instance, Iron Hands, Raven Guard and White Scars didn't have codexes, didn't have supplements, and in many cases didn't even have chapter tactics for a very long time, or at least nothing unique to their chapter tactics. There was no way of taking an Imperial Fist army that was uniquely Imperial Fist without Dianath Lysander. There was no way of taking a uniquely Raven Guard army without taking Cave Shrike, and so on. And the Dark Angels, along with the Blood Angels and Space Wolves, were very much meant to be the special chapters. And the special chapters did very much start off life being like the rest of the chapters, but with a few extra nice gimmicks or a few nice additional things you can have instead of having to play the Ultramarines or a chapter like the Ultramarines. And the thing you have to remember about the Dark Angels is the Dark Angels were always a very Codex-compliant chapter. They weren't like the Space Wolves, who had a completely different roster of units from the word go, and that's only expanded over the years, and eventually we will get Space Wolves, who are Primaris Thunderwolves, maybe, who knows, I'm just putting it out there, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. Moving on. And also the Blood Angels. The Blood Angels, again, a Codex-compliant chapter, but had a few extra gimmicks that have changed over the years. But to keep this focus on the Dark Angels quite resolutely, is that the things that they had back then, their Deathwing and their Ravenwing, like I've said a few times, along with a few special characters that have evolved and adapted and changed over the years, have always very much been what separated them from the crowd. But this then overlooked a very fundamental thing, is that yes, you can have an all-Terminator army. Yes, you can have an all-Ravenwing army. But when you look back at the core parts of the chapter, the regular Marines, Tactical Marines, Dreadnoughts, Assault Marines, those were all still very much the same as they were for the regular Space Marines. It was very much these two extra gimmicks that were changing things. Yes, they had some quite nice unique psychic powers and warlord traits when they came in later on, and relics when they came in, which were all quite good for them. But again, like I said, it was all still very much the same, broadly speaking, as the rest of the Space Marine Codex. Now, if we fast forward to the very beginning of this edition, 8th edition I'm speaking of, not 9th edition, when the new detachment system came in and the new wave of codexes slowly started to come out, a lot of the stuff the Dark Angels had was gone. And you also have to remember is that there was the old formation system from 7th edition, where other Space Marine players could take entire armies of Terminators in the first company formation. Now, formations are a really complicated and really controversial thing amongst some circles, so we won't say too much about them, but in many respects they did rob the Dark Angels of some of their uniqueness in some respects. And what happened in terms of that meant that other players could do things which had in many ways been exclusive to Dark Angels this whole time. And the other thing you have to remember about the Dark Angels is that if we then examine both the Deathwing and the Ravenwing, even in a vacuum and together, there's really still not that much that separates them from the other chapters. Let's take Deathwing Terminators. Now, for a really long time, Deathwing Terminators were unique in the fact that they could be a mixed unit. For some reason, and I don't know why this is, regular Space Marine Terminators have 3 sets of squads. There's your Terminator Assault Squad, which has Thunderhammers and Lightning Claws. You have your regular Terminator Squad, which has all the guns, heavy Hellamers, assault cannons, cyclone missile launchers, etc. And now we have Relic Terminators, which are the Cataphracti and Tartaros Terminators from the Horus Heresy books. Some of them can have a pair of Lightning Claws, some of them can have a Chain Fist and Stormbolter, etc, etc, etc. But this is a bit of a funny one because only regular Space Marines have this limitation. Chaos Space Marines, Grey Knight Terminators, Space Wolf Terminators, and obviously Deathwing Terminators can all have mixed units of weapons. They're not necessarily limited to one type of Terminator squad, either ranged or close combat, and that's it. Now, in some respects, when you think of it in those terms, that straight away means that Deathwing Terminators aren't unique in being able to take a mixed unit. That's something that Space Wolves can also have, and they've been able to have that for a long time as well as Chaos Space Marines and Grey Knights. What does give this a bit of a difference, obviously, is that they do have access to things like plasma cannons, hooray, and they do have Deathwing Knights, which are a relatively new addition in the grand scheme of things, but are still quite a welcome breath of fresh air for the Deathwing, and gives them an extra unit. And this brings me on to my next point, is that the Deathwing and the Ravenwing were very much built around one unit concepts. Obviously, there's only ever really been one type of Space Marine bike, and yes, there has only been one type of Space Marine bike. The attack bike units are very much just built off the same format. It's just the same bike, just a squad of them. And the Deathwing Terminators were still just Terminators. There's only ever been one unit Terminators. I would argue in the most recent supplement, allowing the Dark Angels to have access to everything in the Space Marine Codex, apart from a few choice units, has actually been really quite beneficial for them. They've got access to more things now than they actually have done for most of their histories. They didn't have access to things like Storm Ravens. They didn't have access to Storm Talons. They didn't have access to a whole range of things which they have access to now. And that's actually quite a lot to think about, the fact that they actually gained access to more things by being reassimilated into the Space Marine Codex rather than having their own codex. But this then leads to the next thing about all this, is that whilst we're talking about Deathwing and Ravenwing being built around 2 units, bikes and Terminators respectively, and yes, they both did get their elite of the elite units in the form of Deathwing Knights and Ravenwing Black Knights. Those were good add-ons, but still, that's all they got. And yes, I know the Ravenwing got their new land speeders and they got the Nephilim jet fighter, which were good, and I'm not arguing that point at all. They are good models and they are a nice addition overall. But at the same time, this is very much in line with what other chapters were getting as well. You have to remember, the Space Wolves have their own flyer. The Space Marines were given three different sets of flyers, all in plastic, depending on how you build them. So they were still very much getting things in line with the rest of the Space Marine other Space Marine chapters. The only thing that they were getting, arguably more so, was a few slight changes in how they were equipped. Black Knights for the Raven Wing have access to things like twin plasma talons, as they're called, and the Deathwing Knights had storm shields and maces, which arguably isn't that different from Thunderhammers and Storm Shields on a regular Terminator squad, but that's a surprisingly hot debate. But all this leads me to say is that what was making them seem special in the eyes of players and the lore wasn't actually so special that you couldn't find a fairly solid equivalent elsewhere. And to be honest with you, that's absolutely fine. Games Workshop needed to find a way to make sure that all the Space Marines were balanced in a way that they could be moved between without one overtaking the other. That's fine. That's all fine. And I think if we hadn't had the massive change in 8th and 9th edition, it wouldn't have been much of a problem. But obviously we have. And what do we have now as a result? Well, obviously, detachments now. Detachments, again, if you've watched my video about the detachments, again, are a surprisingly prickly topic. But the detachment system effectively took away the last few things that the Dark Angels had that other chapters couldn't have. Now, I know that in the most recent supplement for the Dark Angels, they did make it very clear that if you take a Vanguard or Outriders detachment, they get elites or fast attack for the respective detachments, get objectives secured, and those command points are refunded if your Warlord's in it. Great, lovely, brilliant. But I would also like to make the point that I've argued before that command points aren't the biggest and most important thing in building an army, because ultimately stratagems are just there to enhance what's already there. It's very, very risky and not really in the spirit of the game to build your army around a particular set of stratagems, and I say that for all of the armies. If you disagree, leave your thoughts in the comments. But at the same time as well, the new detachments have actually helped make more fluffy, more themed, slightly more interesting variations on the lists overall for most armies, not just for specific ones. Now, while most armies don't really make the most of the detachment systems, I do still think that because they have access to it, it doesn't give the Deathwing, or the Dark Angels at least, access to anything that's particularly unique. And then this brings me on to the most important thing about all of this, is that because the Dark Angels gimmick of Deathwing and Ravenwing were taken away from them in some respects, yes, again, you can have both those armies with objective secure, yes, you can have both of those armies with your Warlords refunded command points. That's only really hugely important in a very particular tournament context. Now, I'm not a massive tournament fan, and I do appreciate that anyone who's taking an army from tournament is probably going to want to take that, and yes, it does give both those armies a bit of a more solid competitive edge. But at the same time, so what? So what? You got to remember that at the same time that you can now have armies of Deathwing and Ravenwing, all it really means is that your Outrider and Vanguard detachments are now slightly more competitive. That's it. But if we then flick across to every other Space Marine chapter, you can have an all-Terminator army with Ultramarines, Flesh Terrors, White Scars, Black Templars, Iron Hands, Imperial Fists, just to name a few. It's no longer unique to one chapter. But at the same time, and this is kind of a bit more important I'd say, is that because the Dark Angels are now a supplement and no longer their own codex, they have been able to flesh out in other ways that does actually enhance those two sides of things, Deathwing and Ravenwing, to make them better overall, which is good for them. But there's very little for the Green Marines. And this brings me to the real point of what all of this is about. I've talked mostly about Deathwing and about Ravenwing in this video, but I've not mentioned much about the core of the chapter, you know, those Green Marines, the Green Angels as they're sometimes called. And there's a reason for that, because virtually no one else does. When you speak to most Dark Angels players, most of them do have at least a small number of core Green Marines, but they mostly stick to either their Ravenwing or Deathwing armies. But the Green Marines themselves are very much in line with the rest of the Space Marine chapters and are very much benefit purely from the sorts of things that the rest of Space Marines have. They have the same strengths and the same weaknesses, the same equipment, the same loadouts. The Blood Angels, Space Wolves, and even arguably the Death Watch all make a bit more of the Space Marine units they have access to from the main Space Marine Codex than the Dark Angels do. And why is that? Well, I think it's fair to say that in the spirit of the Dark Angels having their gimmick for all these years, they have become the focus, whilst the rest of the chapter suffers. And now that the gimmick isn't as special to them, as it is now slightly more accessible to the other chapters, it means that the Green Marines are having to be re-examined in a slightly more critical way. And you can't just neglect half of a Space, or more than that, 80% of a Space Marine chapter for nearly 10 years and expect it to perform as well as everything else. If we look at things like Grey Hunters from the Space Wolves, the Strike Squads from the Grey Knights, and even the Death Company from the Blood Angels, they've all changed quite a lot over the years, and they've all been updated and been given rules, even if it's only very subtly, or equipment changes, or different rules on the battlefield. They've been given quite a lot. But we don't see the same thing with the Green Marines for the Dark Angels. They are arguably very much the same as they were in 2007 as they are now, with the only real exceptions obviously being the same improvements that the rest of the Space Marines have been given. So when we say all of this, what does this mean for the Dark Angels as a chapter? Well, it means that the two pillars that the Dark Angels have been holding themselves up on don't really have the same appeal as they did a few years ago, because of the accessibility for other armies to have very similar things. And at the same time, the Green Marines themselves are now having to stand up on their own, but ultimately don't really do that in a particularly satisfying way. They're not bringing so much more to the table because they've not been given that much more than a lot of the other chapters were given. So at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves the question, did the Dark Angels lose their gimmick? And I would have to say unequivocally, yes, they did lose their gimmick. They didn't lose their ability to be a good chapter, though. They can still be competitive if you play them like other Space Marines. But in many respects, that's kind of the problem. And as all the other chapters have been given their own supplements and characters and interesting things and ways to play, in many respects, chapters like the Iron Hands, the White Scars, the Imperial Fists have made bigger strides overall in the past 10 years, or the past 5 years at least, than the Dark Angels have in the past 10 years, and that's actually quite sad. The Dark Angels were one of the pillars of the Space Marine fort in many ways. They were a big deal. They were one of the big four chapters, and they even had their own place in the starter set not that long ago, and to see them start to fall behind like this is a bit of a shame. I think everyone was hoping that the new supplement was going to be the way to bring the Dark Angels up to the next step, but ultimately all it did was try to reinvent ever so slightly the wheel on the new Primaris models, just to keep the Ravenwing and Deathwing a little bit more inclusive and a bit more integrated with the Primaris, but again leaving the core of the chapter, the Green Marines, behind, and that's a real shame. And I think that is a loss that a lot of Dark Angel players probably do feel quite frustrated about, and I'm on your side, Dark Angel players. I do think an opportunity was missed, because ultimately the gimmick that the chapter has been standing on for a very long time is still very much the only thing that has been given to them. So with all that said, what does the future hold for the Dark Angels? Well, it's not going to change for a really long time now. Obviously, we've just had a new edition, we've just had a new supplement, we've just had a new Space Marine Codex, and as a side note, I think it is worth mentioning as well that when we look at the special character choices, that's also a bit of a shame. Ragnar and Mephiston getting lovely updates and with lovely new Primaris models was something which made lots of people very happy. Even Kasaro Khan's model was a welcome change. But this Lazarus guy, who is he? And I don't mean to be dismissive or disparaging, because it's a nice enough model, but where's a new Azrael? Where's a new Belial, even though that is a fairly new model? Where's a new Asmodee? Where are the classic characters who actually needed their Primaris update? I'd actually probably stick with Azrael, to be honest with you. He's the one who needed it more than the others, at the same time that people like Calgar was getting an update. This was the sort of time where a new Azrael would have been perfect, but he didn't get one, which is a massive shame. So it raises the question, what does the future hold for the Dark Angels now that their gimmick has been somewhat taken away? And now that the Dark Angels have to compete more with the other first founding chapters than they ever had to do in their history before? I don't know. I'm not sure what it's going to be. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and if you agree or disagree with the things I've said so far tonight. Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So those are my thoughts on the Dark Angels chapter as they are. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below as well. And whilst you're down there, as always, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. So somewhat thinking of doing a live stream at some point, like on Twitch or on Discord or on just on YouTube Live, I don't really know. Let me know if you guys are interested in that as well down in the comments. Like I said, just thinking about it, don't know what it would be about, so if you've got ideas for that too, then leave them down there as well. And whilst you're down there, you know what to do. Thank you all very, very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.